Good morning. It's December 23rd, 2024. I'm Harley Schlanger with your daily LaRouche Organization video update. Well, Christmas is usually a time when people worldwide pray for peace on earth. And as the new year comes, there's always hope that we'll enter a peaceful new year. But we're in a world where there's anything but peace. And this was brought home to me last night in an interview I did with a television reporter from a major Middle Eastern country. He opened by saying that with the proliferation of crisis, some are saying we are in a world war. Do you agree? And I explained that what we're facing is an epic struggle to move to a new era, away from an era of imperialism, of the looting of developing sector, the control of the world by a global oligarchy which is committed to maintaining a unipolar order. And I said, it's not a series of local battles. I've been calling it a global great game 2.0. And the issue is whether the Anglo-American oligarchy can be made to give up their intent of maintaining this unipolar order. Now, they're prepared to go to nuclear war to protect it. And he said, well, are they really willing to go to nuclear war to protect it? And I reviewed the statements of Admiral Buchanan of Stratcom, who basically said the U.S. is prepared to engage in nuclear war. And so then he asked me, well, will Trump stop it, or is he part of it? And do the American people know how close we are to a World War III? Now, our assessment is that the truth must be told that we are heading toward World War III, which could be a nuclear war. Now, he was clearly emotional, and he told me after the interview that he was not asking these questions as a newscaster, but as a father and as a grandfather. He said he's been distraught for months and is in anguish every time he reads about the lives of innocent children being killed, whether it's by Israel or at a Christmas market in Magdeburg, Germany. And he said, that could be my daughter or my granddaughter. And I keep thinking, can you tell the American people what it is to live like that? And then he asked a final question. This was after the interview, but he said, if we survive Biden, how do we know that Trump won't do the same? Now, I told him, we can't place our trust in one man. It's a system we're fighting. Now, a demonstration of this was covered on Russian television the other night, in which Maria Zakharova, the spokesman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, said that it was the British that were behind the killing of General Kirillov, the director of nuclear planning and chemical weapons from Russia. And it was reported by Gilbert Doctorow, a noted expert, that Kirillov, according to Zakharova, was killed by MI6, that he was targeted because he debunked the British story of the poisoning of the Skripals, the chemical poisoning of the Skripals in Britain. And she said that the Russians believed that the masterminds behind the killing were Anglo-Saxons. And what Doctorow said is that she meant the British, and that this was an MI6 operation. Now, the question is, why would they do that? And it's the same reason why they're conducting a Great Game 2.0. For the same reason of the original Great Game of World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, to protect the empire, an imperial system of looting in which handfuls of corporate cartels use the governments of the world for their own benefit. And the innocents are slaughtered as collateral damage of that fight. Now, let me give you one more example of how the war in Ukraine has been spun by that empire to convince you that it's Putin and the Russians who are responsible because they took an unprovoked response to the West. That is, that the launching of the special military operation in 2022 by Putin was an irrational, unprovoked attack on Europe and Western values. Now, the example that I'm going to give you, actually two examples, is that in the early 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, after the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, the peaceful dissolution, the West's policies toward Russia were aimed at destroying the Russian nation. And those policies were shock therapy and the eastward expansion of NATO. And that's what's provoked the situation over the last 30 years, which we're in today. Now, just last week, there was a new document that was released by the Freedom of Information Act from the U.S. Embassy in 1994. Let me read to you from the report that I filed on this, because it will show you what we're talking about. On March 28, 1994, as the British-U.S. shock therapy economic policy was depopulating post-Soviet Russia, a critique of that policy was drafted by the chief political analyst at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. The memo, drafted by E. Wayne Mary, was not distributed and remained suppressed for 30 years. Following a Freedom of Information Act filed by the National Security Archives, it was published on December 18, 2024, under the title, The Long Telegram of the 1990s. Whose Russia is it anyway? Towards a policy of benign respect. And what Mary wrote in that document is that the democratic forces in Russia are in trouble. This is in 1994. Here's his quote, "We are not helping with a misguided overemphasis on market economics. There is no reason to believe the Russian economy is capable of rapid market reform." And he said that the idea of attacking Russia when their choices of democracy do not achieve an American standard of success is dangerous. He said America should be concerned with the fate of Russian democracy, but not to the choices that democracy may make about the distribution of its own wealth and about the organization of its means of production and finance. For 30 years, that was suppressed. And you can see why the West is untrusted by the Russians. That's just another example. But the Russians know about the shock therapy policy. They may not have known about the Mary memo, but the memo just confirms what they believed. Now, there's a second memo of equal importance, I think, from February 1st, 2008, written from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, just like the Mary memo. And it was drafted by Ambassador William Burns. And it was about NATO enlargement. And he wrote a memo under the headline, "Niet means niet, no means no. Russia's NATO enlargement red lines." And he has a section where he starts, "Russia's opposition to NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia is both emotional and based on perceived strategic concerns about the impact on Russia's interests." And the memo goes on to state that this is an existential question for the Russian government. Now, those two memos point to an absolute indication of the West's intention under a geopolitical strategic doctrine to prevent the emergence of a rival, as Brzezinski called it, in Eurasia, to break apart Russia, to use such tactics as a war by Ukraine, funded by NATO and backed by NATO, to weaken Russia. At the same time that the shock therapy policy was designed not just to enrich a handful of oligarchs, but to take apart the potential for a democratic Russia to emerge. Now, these are two clear statements that it was the United States and the Western countries, because the British were in over their heads on both of those, and were in some cases calling the shots, as we see from the subsequent events in Ukraine. It tells us that the Russian response was not unprovoked, but was based on years of waiting for the West to recognize legitimate security interests of Russia. Now, as my new acquaintance from a television station in the Middle East indicated, the question that we have to answer is, do the American people know this? Well, our job at the LaRouche Organization and the Schiller Institute is not only to make sure that they know it, but they know there's an alternative. And toward that end, I'm putting in the description box links to two things. One is the document 10 Fundamental Principles for a New Security and Development Architecture, written by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and secondly, a report on the most recent International Peace Coalition meeting from last Friday. Take the time over the next days to study these two reports. Your lives and the lives of hundreds of millions of people may depend on you joining us in this new year in action to take power out of the hands of the oligarchs and restore it to the Republican institutions of the American Constitution. There's no more urgent requirement from the coming new year. So thank you for joining me. Merry Christmas to all of you.